Okay. So let's pass to stakeholder management. And in stakeholder management, it is a very important and key thing that we need to think about before going to requirement gathering. And it is very detrimental if we do not identify key stakeholders to our system. Okay, so there is what we call the definition. Yeah, the definition of the stakeholder is people, those people interested in the success, sometimes in the failure of a system, are the stakeholders of the system. So you need to identify who are those individuals, who are those groups of people who are interested in the system, right? It might be in the success, or sometimes, as I said, it might be in the failure of the system. So it is a must to identify all that, and it might include senior executives, project organization roles, client organization roles, system developers, even IT operations, customers, and others who have their eye on the system are the stakeholders. So, and we will proceed and we will talk about the identification of stakeholders. So you need to identify the correct people who are really concerned. So you need to classify them. We will talk about the classification in the stakeholders. So we need to find out who gains and who loses from this development, and who controls change management of processes. So there happens a change in implementing the system, right? So those old methods will be replaced by the new information system. So there you need to think about who will manage the change management process, which happens after the implementation, and who will make decisions, who is the decisive person or individual who procures IT systems, and who decides what to buy about payments, logistics, and who is responsible, who controls resources, about resources, who is really controlling the resources, is the project manager, or who is actually controlling those resources, who has special skills the project needs. So you have different competencies, roles, as we talked about earlier in system development, who has those specialist skills, and who has influence actually. Influence is a very key thing in identifying stakeholders, and who is the project champion facilitates progress, whereas the project sponsor sells change to users. So you need to identify both aspects very crucially. So these identifications can have major impact on the success or failure of the system. So you need to prioritize and understand your stakeholders. It is a very key and crucial thing. So the first this grid is like divided into two categories. It is about interest and power. So those who have for example, let's say those who have high interest and then low power are to be kept informed, right? So those who have low interest and low power should be monitored somewhat. So you closely monitor those people. So let's see the high. So high interest and high power should be managed very closely. So in terms of, when you say managing, you have to update them in terms of, because they have the interest in the system, they need an update. Because they have the power in the system, they need that sustainability. You should assure them that the system is progressing very well. And then if they're not well informed. If they have no knowledge about what is happening, they might even halt the project. So they need to be kept very, very closely managed. So as you can see, you need to understand what their feeling is. So after classifying your stakeholders in terms of their power and their interest, and you need to actually determine what to do with their feelings. So if you can manage these feelings, you have high probability that your system is going to succeed. High probability. So another way is classifying stakeholders in terms of internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, operational stakeholders, and executive stakeholders. So internal stakeholders are those within the organization. So external stakeholders are those outside of the organization's control and influence. Whereas the operational stakeholders are those who regularly interact with the system. So there is an existing system, and then this existing system have what you call operational stakeholders who interact with the system in a day-to-day basis, or they actually access the system in most frequently than those people. Those are operational stakeholders. And executive stakeholders. Executives are those who do not interact directly with the system, but who either use the information produced by the system or have a significant financial or other interests in its operation and success. So these are executive stakeholders. And let's come to this matrix, and this shows that internal stakeholders can be operational and then executive at a time, and external stakeholders can be operational and executive at a time. So here in external stakeholders, if they are partner organizations, if they are external customers, for example, talk about e-commerce, online commerce, their customers are external stakeholders, which are outside to the control of the organization. And then there are investors also, which are executive, which might influenced by the information that is produced by the system. Operational stakeholders, for example, internal stakeholder operational, which are operational, are accountants or clerks, you can say, are operational stakeholders, and at the time they are internal stakeholders. They are enrolled within the organization, recruited within the organization. And there are also internal auditors, can be an example of internal operational stakeholders. There is also a fuzzy line, which contains the operational managers, which interacts with the system in a day-to-day basis and also have a high influence or is in the position of decisive position. So that is the operational manager. So with this, you can help yourself in identifying the correct stakeholders in your system. All right, so let's talk about managing stakeholder expectations. So stakeholders have their own expectation. For example, let's take the example of creating a means to transport a single individual from home to place of work. So let's say this is a requirement. So to perform this requirement, the management interpreted this requirement as this bicycle. So, and then the IT interpreted the requirement as these means of transportation, and then the user interpreted it as this car, this vehicle, which is fancy one, of course. So here the system might fail if they don't meet expectations. So IT systems are often oversold, right? So they are oversold. So in terms of overselling a system, it's about it's about the payment, and the features are not comparable. That is what we mean by overselling a system. So every interaction with a stakeholder creates an impression, which is business people and IT people, you know what you call. So IT people interpret differently, business people who work in the organization interpret in a different manner. So if you can't manage these expectations, the system will fail. So these expectations has to be managed very, very closely, so that the system will succeed or will be deployed at last. So so there is your role as a system analyst, as a system developer. You need to get these disparate, these unequal and matched views to come together and create a shared vision. So that is the role. After understanding your stakeholders, and then after you put in the work, it will usually result in the ownership of a long-term commitment to the project. So there is an activity again to identify the key stakeholders for the student information system. So here you can use the internal, external, executive, operational classification, and then you can then prioritize them using the power and influence grid. So you need to identify or prioritize your stakeholders so that later it won't come back to hunt you down. So that's all about, think about it. What are the stakeholders in the student information system? And for example, you might take another example of a hospital information system and think about what your stakeholders might be, and classify them and then prioritize them. That would be very instrumental in the future development of the system. So up to now, we know that why we want to gather requirements, what we need to investigate, who we need to gather these requirements from, our stakeholders. And then the next step is to work out how to find out what the user wants. It is about investigating system requirements. So in system requirements, look at this picture, our conversation, and there is the system analyst, and there is the one who wants to, or the user or the stakeholder who wants to who wants a system. So here I will need to know your requirements before I start to design the software, she asked. And then after the discussion, and then what are you trying to accomplish, she asked. And I'm trying to make you design my software. I mean, what are you trying to accomplish with the software? And he said, I won't know what I can accomplish until you tell me what the software can do. So there's the argy-bargy going on here, and he is trying to know if she can design his software, and he is trying to know his requirements. So and then she asked, try to get this concept, and she said, the software can do whatever I design it to do. And there was a moment of silence, and then he said, can you design it to tell you my requirements? So and that's all. There will be some difficult times when gathering or investigating requirements. So users might find it difficult to articulate exactly what they want, which is to specify the requirements, and then the analyst should assess these requirements by using different angles, different techniques of gathering requirements. So this takes us to the common fact-finding techniques, which are the interview, which is a very common one, and the questionnaire, and observation, and then the reviewing existing reports or forms, and then researching vendor solutions are the common fact-finding techniques to gather requirements. So let's talk about the interview. So in the interview, it is an effective way to understand business function, but it is usually time consuming and resource intensive, as it's done using multiple sessions. Not one session is sufficient to conduct a requirement gathering using an interview. So in preparing for a successful interview, you need to set clear objectives of that specific interview. What types of information do you expect to get from the interview? So you should have a clear goal. Is the best way to get the information I need? So is this the best way? There are two types of interviews, and which one is the best way? For example, you might use reviewing existing forms to get that specific information. So you need to set a clear objective, and then that objective, is it going to be achieved by the interview? And are there any gaps within the information I have that might require the client interaction? So you need to identify all that before going to an interview. So preparing for a successful interview, it's about selecting appropriate stakeholders to interview. Who are you going to interview? And then do your research about the participant. Know what the participant is, which position he is on, and which activities he performs, business process, which he is supposed to be knowledgeable about. So that is a preliminary before conducting an interview. And then you need to determine the type of interview, whether it has to be one-on-one interview and whether it has to be a group interview. So in one-on-one interview between two people, the interviewee and the interviewer, it is typically more comfortable for the participant or the interviewee. So he may be willing to share more information than when in a group or environment. So in the group interview, it is a very great way to get a range of information in a short amount of time. It might be difficult to schedule because many people, many schedules. So you need to have a common schedule to meet. So this might be difficult to schedule. So it might be difficult whenever a conflict happens. This may slow down your decision-making process or your requirement gathering for that matter. So, and then if dealing with group of representative users have to get back to their respective groups before they can make decisions. So that is one way, but it is actually very instrumental, very key whenever you have a conflicting idea before and you want to solve that idea or that requirement between stakeholders who are actually involved in the execution of that specific business process you want to know about. And after an argument, you might have the clearest and the possibly a very clear requirement. So and In the next one, prepare before going to an interview. You might need to observe different formats related to that, related to the objective of your interview. So you need to observe. So you don't need to go into the interview to know everything about the business process. Rather, you need to priorly determine some. You need to have some knowledge about what you are going to. So before conducting that interview, you need to have the knowledge, the know-how about what you're going to. So the next one is preparing for a successful interview. You need to develop an agenda. This agenda will help you. And there are three things. The setting you determine the objective, and then the date, time the interview would be held, and the location of the interview, and the user participant, who is your participant, and the name, title, positions. That is a very good way, and this should be in line with your what you call the objective. Yeah, the objective of the interview, and then the project team that is going to conduct the interview. And then there are to be interview or discussion guiding questions. This has to be put down in a logical manner, in a flow, in a clear flow. So you need to put what questions at first, and then how questions later. So you need to have a very consistent questions. And there are also follow-ups. Follow-ups are for issues that have been previously unresolved. So you want to resolve issues, and you put them in the follow-up section of your interview agenda, and then when you are going to the interview, you will follow up these issues and then solve them. So that is pretty much the components of the interview agenda. Again, some tips and techniques: avoid long interviews, and several shorter interviews are better, because participants often are exhausted pretty early in the interview. So you need to have you need to avoid long interviews. And then planning. So as we said, interviews have been sent, and the location, time, objectives, and list of questions has to be finalized. And then you need to arrive early and ensure the room is prepared to conduct interviews. Decide on a document method, whether you take notes, whether you record, whether you videotape the participant. You need to decide on that. Tips and tricks: there is a link in the notes, and you can go to that video and see the whole tips and tricks for a successful interview. So checklist for before going to an interview, you can do this checklist. So on the before section, you need to establish the objectives for the interview, determine the correct users to be involved, determine the project team members to participate, and during, you need to arrive on time, look for exceptions and error conditions in the system, right? So probe for details. So you need to go for details, ask in detail about the question. Those guiding questions are only questions that will guide you. Then rather, you need to probe more for detailed explanation. Take through thorough notes. So you need to have notes specifically related to requirements you think that are going to be requirements. You need to take them in a very thorough note, or as we discussed in the previous slide, you need to have tape recorder or videotape for that matter to conduct to facilitate this note-taking process. And identify and document unanswered items or open questions, as we said, the follow-up. And after the interview, you need to review notes for accuracy, completeness, and understanding. So review your notes you've taken, transfer information to appropriate models and techniques, or documents. So after the interview, you need to quickly, I recommend to quickly transfer this information before you forget the vibe of the interview. You need to transfer this information to the appropriate models, or you need to document these requirements and identify areas needing further clarification. As we said, identify follow-ups, and then thank the participants after the interview and follow up and open and unanswered questions. So this is pretty much the checklist for conducting an interview. And then to get the information you want, beware that excessive attention given to current system may result in suggesting a new system that only automates the current system. So when you review current business problems, if you focus on the problems, the current system operations, you only end up in automating, that is the paper-based being taken into the electronic system. Electronic system being a carbon copy of the paper-based. So rather you need to think out of the box, which enables you to solve, to witness a problem, to solve, to propose a solution for that problem. So there are sample question themes. So there are themes: what are the business operations and processes? It is theme 1, and you can ask the users, what do you do, and what are you performing, and such questions, and how should those operations be performed. So there are operations, and how should those be performed. So in this, how do you do it, you can ask. So this is how they currently manage to do that operation, and then what steps do you follow, and the steps, and how could they be done differently. So if you are going to solve or to enhance a current business operation, so you need to ask, how could they be done differently? Can you see a way that these operations be performed in a different manner? You might modify this question and assess whether there are options to modify or enhance the operation. What information is needed to perform those operations? What information do you use here, and the inputs, the outputs they produce. So you can ask these types of questions, and first you identify theme, and the theme will guide you to propose the different questions. So there is the interview follow-up. As I said, all documentation created after the interview should be reviewed by the participants for accuracy as soon as possible after the interview, and there should be a follow-up of unresolved issues. So unresolved issues will cause, in terms of the system, it will cause anxiety, and it will probably be the reason the system fails. But if you can follow up the question track and then resolve the unresolved questions, you might end up being happy and successful. So you can have this table which talks about the outstanding issues control table. And what is the issue? It's about partial shipments, and then when was it identified, and the target end date, and here is the responsible person who gathered the information, and then the user to contact who is responsible to giving the information. And then the question is to ship partials or wait for a full shipment. So here there are two sides, whether to ship partials or wait for fulfillment. So you need to solve this issue as soon as possible by communicating with the user. So there is what you call the activity, and here you've been asked to prepare an interview. There is on your text the Bill Willie Spot Courier Service, and read that problem and then prepare an interview or you can even prepare an interview for a teacher in the student information system. So we've been talking about the student information system, and prepare a set of questions, an interview agenda for that matter, which contains the setting, the interview questions and the follow-ups, and prepare an interview agenda, and then prepare a set of questions which are consistent enough, which are logical. So that concludes today's session.